A little while ago, I had the good fortune to do a fellowship through the State Library on writing some songs about issues around conscription in Queensland in the First World War. I'm going to sing you one of those songs now, because I came across some great and weird stories. Some of the stories are better known than others, but this one is known as the Warwick Egg Incident, which led to this song. A little bit of background. In the First World War, Billy Hughes was the Prime Minister. Back then, if you wanted to have someone who began life as a Labor Prime Minister and became a Conservative Prime Minister, they did it by actually changing parties rather than just shifting their views over time. And Billy Hughes was actually thrown out of the Labor Party for supporting conscription. He thought it was really important that Australia had enough men in the war by the end of the war, because it would give us great bargaining power when it came to dividing up the world. That's probably a shorthand way of putting it. There were a lot of people who weren't as keen on conscription, mostly people who were eligible for conscription. They weren't keen. And Australia actually did have conscription throughout the First World War, but they weren't allowed to send people overseas as a result of conscription. I'm not exactly sure how that happened, but it wasn't really what Hughes wanted. So he had a couple of plebiscites, a word which has come rushing back into currency, which is wonderful, so I don't have to explain what a plebiscite is. And he thought that if he had the popular vote behind him, he could persuade the Senate, which he didn't have a majority in the Senate. I'm not sure if you can understand that concept. So he couldn't force through things he wanted, so he thought the plebiscite was the way to go. When he was heading back to Sydney from Brisbane, when a whole lot of jolly stuff had gone on, he stopped in Warwick, and as was his habit, he got out of the train and made a big speech. Everywhere he went, it was a great form of entertainment. Crowds of supporters and people in opposition to him would gather and shout and yell at each other and stuff, and very exciting. And Hughes rose to speak and almost immediately was hit by 2 eggs. He was a man with something of a temper. He became known as the Little Digger because he was such a favourite of the soldiers. He had to be stopped from getting off the speaking platform and entering into the fight twice by the policemen who were with him. He wanted the guy who threw the eggs. They could identify who it was. It was a fellow called Paddy Brosnan, who was, and as luck would have it, an Irishman, because the Irish Catholics in Australia were dead against conscription. And so he wanted him arrested immediately, and the local police sergeant refused. He asked awkward questions like, what for? And the Prime Minister said, well, I'm the Prime Minister and I want him arrested. And the police sergeant, to his everlasting credit, replied, well, I'm a Queensland policeman. I answer to the Queensland government, not to the Prime Minister. Hughes went back to Sydney and submitted that the policeman should be arrested. The Queensland government wasn't interested, but Hughes, one of the very next things he did, he founded something which eventually became the Australian Federal Police, half of which was based in Queensland. There was a bunch of undercover officers in Warwick for the date of the next conscription referendum. It passed without incident. But I thought the incident, the egg, deserved a song because it became such a popular subject of cartoons at the time. So I wrote this song. It has a chorus, and as with anything tonight, you're welcome to join in. If there is a caveat on that, though. If you do join in, do your best to join in with me rather than just join in. I might sing some of your favourite songs. If I don't, please don't sing some of your favourite songs. Oh, and for those who don't know, this is a concertina. I was thinking about this the other day and I realised that I'm 52. I play concertina on a semi-professional basis and I've recently taken up the trombone. I think I'm making up for a former life in which I was very, very cool. In November 1917, Australia was at war. The soldiers in their thousands had sailed to foreign shores. Billy Hughes was for conscription, he hoped to win the fight. when into Warwick town he came to shout with all his might. But not every heart was with him upon that fateful day, as the PM moved among them to stand and have his say. They waited in their hundreds and they stood there in the sun, and one was there, an Irishman. He was keen to try his arm. Oh, who threw the egg at poor old Billy as he stood there on the back end of the train? Who threw the egg at poor old Billy? Oh, what a scandal, what a shame. He sends the young men off to war to face the death and gore. But such a horror as this day you never saw before, the day that someone threw an egg at poor old Billy as he stood there on the back end of the train. For as Billy rose to speak his piece, an egg flew through the air. It knocked the PM's hat off where it fell upon the stair. The effect was not relaxing. The PM's rage was fierce. He tried to jump into the crowd to box the Eggman's ears. Oh, who threw the egg at poor old Billy as he stood there on the back end of the train? Who threw the egg at poor old Billy? Oh, what a scandal, what a shame. He sends the young men off to war to face the death and gore. But such a horror as this day you never saw before, the day that someone threw an egg at poor old Billy as he stood there on the back end of the train. The manic little digger began to scream and yell, I am the leader of the land, I want him in a cell. Sergeant Kenny said in Warwick, only Queensland law is true, and while you are PM, you cannot tell me what to do. Oh, who threw the egg at poor old Billy as he stood there on the back end of the train? Who threw the egg at poor old Billy? Oh, what a scandal, what a shame. He sends the young men off to war to face the death and gore. But such a horror as this day you never saw before, the day that someone threw an egg at poor old Billy as he stood there on the back end of the train. So remember dear old Warwick, remember Billy Hughes, the tiniest little digger with an even shorter fuse. And remember Paddy Brosnan, the one who threw the eggs and sent Hughes back to Sydney with his tail between his legs. Oh, who threw the egg at poor old Billy as he stood there on the back end of the train? Who threw the egg at poor old Billy? Oh, what a scandal, what a shame. He sends the young men off to war to face the death and gore. But such a horror as this day you never saw before, the day that someone threw an egg at poor old Billy as he stood there on the back end of the train. Oh, who threw the egg at poor old Billy as he stood there on the back end of the train? Who threw the egg at poor old Billy? Oh, what a scandal, what a shame. He sends the young men off to war to face the death and gore. But such a horror as this day you never saw before, the day that someone threw an egg at poor old Billy as he stood there on the back end of the train. Paddy Brosnan threw the egg at poor old Billy as he stood there on the back end of the train.